Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is a bonus episode about Agenda 47 and Project 2025. So there has recently been a lot of discussion flying around about Project 2025. And, what I found, it can be difficult to even find a concise definition of it that isn't loaded with kind of positive, or I should say partisan or derogatory language. But I'm going to give it a shot. We'll see how I do here. So what I came up with is, in simple terms, Project 2025 is a set of conservative policy proposals from the Heritage Foundation for how the next president should manage and reform the administrative state upon assuming office. And Trump recently has tried to distance himself from some of it, particularly some of the abortion stuff. The thing is over 900 pages long. There's a bunch in there. I would say some of them are some things to be concerned about. Some are pretty fringe conservative views, but there's also a lot of proposals that I think you could see finding some more broad support. I think it's fair to say it's got good ideas, bad ideas, and ideas that are just never going to see the light of day. And on that point, that kind of takes us, it's an important note to me, at least, that I think it's something to really note that Trump doesn't like to be told what to do. So I think he's going to pick and choose what he wants to take out of, what he wants to implement out of Project 2025. He just doesn't like having somebody else's mandate dictate what he does. So I see that as his personality, that he will not necessarily just take it and do everything in there. And that kind of takes us to where we are now, where all of Project 2025 is, the 900 and something pages is way more than we can really talk about here. But some of the more extreme ideas do overlap with Trump's agenda. He's publicly put this on his website in a series of videos he calls Agenda 47. And there's even too much in Agenda 47 for us to cover all of that. So I picked three things that I find kind of concerning that I think we can talk about. And one of those is, first is impoundment power. We'll talk more about what that means, reissuing Schedule F, and we'll go down that rabbit hole a little bit. And then this concern about reducing the political independence of the DOJ. So I've picked those three as some of the more extreme and concerning aspects of, and those are in both Project 2025 and in Trump's own Agenda 47. And there are a lot of other things we could talk about, but I think those are some of the most significant. And Trump can't really distance himself from these because these are on his website and it's part of his stated agenda. So before we jump into those details, I want to introduce our guest, Dr. Sean Evans, professor of political science and chair of the Department of Political Science at Union University. Dr. Evans is here to be a voice of reason in these heated times to help us navigate anxieties with a healthy dose of optimism and grounded perspective. Welcome, Dr. Evans.
Thank you for having me.
You sent over a column that you wrote, which I really liked it, and talking about sort of how we're going to escape from the doom loop. And in that piece, you say, the problem is that escalating polarization actually threatens democracy. The two most important norms of democracy are recognizing the legitimacy of one's opponents, which in parentheses, mutual toleration, and leaders not abusing their powers, even when it's legal, institutional forbearance. Yet when the other side is an existential threat, they must be stopped at all costs. Once this mentality takes over, polarization spirals until democracy breaks down. And that's something we've talked about on this show with many of the guests that have come on. Andrea Shedler talked about that, and others have as well. And also Leah Braley, you may be familiar with her work, but her research, she talked to us about how people on both sides overestimate the willingness of those on the other side to violate democratic norms. And then that makes makes they themselves more willing to violate those same norms. And I think that's a big piece of this, is that we also tend to have perceived threats are much worse than the real threats. And that can take us in this part of the doom loop as well. And so you finish that piece with, one benefit of democracy is that we resolve our conflicts with ballots, not bullets. For all our sakes, we need to escape the partisan doom loop and tone down our political language. Now, I couldn't agree more, and that's how I want to frame today's conversation. But before we jump into those details, I wanted to say that, from our conversations, you're pretty sanguine about Project 2025 and Agenda 47, and even a second Trump term in general, I think. Is that fair to say?
Well, okay, yes. I mean, the way I would say it is, I believe that he is unfit to be president, but I'm not afraid if he actually wins because I believe that our system works and continues to work, and that people can hold him and his party accountable in the elections. And so, in the end, I think people fear the worst. They fear what's possible, not always what is probable. And I think a lot of their fears are improbable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I definitely want to. Well, and some of that will probably come out as we go down these individual issues, but there are some aspects of that I do want to make sure we cover. So I'll try to work that in. But yeah, the first thing on the my little list of three things is this increased impoundment power, and there's this Impoundment Control Act of 1974 that theoretically, maybe with immunity, he could disregard that without fear of legal repercussions.
No, no.
Right. That's what I want you to kind of counter some of this. So that's one of the theories is that could happen, and then he could selectively fund and defund things. So I think you're sort of saying there's backstops that would stop him from doing that.
Right. So when you are looking at presidential immunity, it does not include violations of separation of powers. Because the basic idea, if it's contrary to the separation of powers, it's not official conduct. So the president can try to impound money and he can try to ignore why Congress's complaints, but Congress will complain. It will go to the courts. And I would imagine that the courts are going to side with Congress in that instance, in which case, at that point, I fully anticipate that Trump would back down.
So you were saying that even with this, the way the immunity has been framed, and even with some of the deliberations they've had about it, you feel like it would not apply if it's crossing separation of powers in some way?
Chief Justice John Roberts said that specifically in the majority opinion.
Mm-hmm. And so the Congress could potentially be the ones to bring that case, or could that case come from any other sources?
Yeah, it could come from Congress. It could come from people who are injured by the president not spending that money. So if he wants to prevent spending in social welfare programs, the people who would potentially receive that money could sue because they have been injured. They meet standing. They can challenge the conduct of the president.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess the same argument would apply to anything involving unilaterally trying to either stop or redirect funds, would be your opinion?
Yes. I mean, I think if he tries that, there will be people in Congress who will challenge it. There will be other people who challenge it. If this affects states in any way, then you will see state attorney generals who are going to challenge that. There are already people who are planning on how to respond to a Trump presidency if he wins. They're looking at all the things in Agenda 47, Project 2025, and they are preparing their legal briefs just in case. And so no matter what he does, it is going to be challenged. And I think we have to wait for things to work its way through the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did see several organizations sort of put out memos to that effect that they, sort of working with their teams of lawyers to try to figure out all these different scenarios and how they might respond to it.
So here let me try to say this about what I think Trump v. U.S. is designed to do. I think the whole point that Chief Justice Roberts is making with the idea that the president has immunity and core constitutional responsibilities is that he's trying to prevent the criminalization of policy differences. And so this distinction between official and private conduct is his attempt to try to do this. If the president is acting as president in a way that the president is able to act, then he should not be prosecuted for those actions. But if he does something that is not within that realm, then it is as a private person. And so if you look at what Chief Justice Roberts says, he talks about how the president talking to people in states about potentially changing votes, that's potentially not within the gamut of presidential authority because the president doesn't oversee elections, states do. And so the idea is a district court would have to figure out if that is a private or a official act. And as Justice Barrett says in her concurrence, she makes a strong case about why this is a private act. And so I think in that respect, the protections are not as broad as we think, in which case, if you can always make the case that the president is acting in a private capacity, then the president can be charged.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought that up too about the states, because that's something else that we talked about before that you were kind of reminding me about, that, you know, we are a federal system. So the federal government doesn't have power over everything. And you were saying that states and even down to local level could potentially also play roles as kind of backstops to some of this, right?
Of course, yes. Yeah, so I mean, if we look at this, there is a principle in constitutional law called the anti-commandeering doctrine, which basically says the federal government cannot make state and localities carry out federal laws or federal acts. The idea is states are sovereign in their own right. So a lot of people are talking about how the Supreme Court is empowering the president. I think they're looking at some cases and not others, because there are quite a few other cases where the Supreme Court is actually constraining the executive branch. And what we have to remember is what's good for the goose is good for the gander. These things that apply to Democrats will also apply to Republicans. So let me give you an example. So the Supreme Court in Loper v. Raimondo overturned the Chevron doctrine. The Chevron doctrine basically says any reasonable interpretation that a agency makes is acceptable. Now let's think about that. A reasonable interpretation. Do you think an agency can make a reasonable interpretation of about anything that it wants to do? I mean, that's kind of what we're looking at here. The Chevron doctrine had no limiting power. Where are the limits on that? And so if Trump says it's reasonable to think that if people are here illegally, I can deport them, in Chevron, there's the case that you can make that the court should defer to that. In Loper, what the court is saying is that the courts also play a role in determining what the law says. The president doesn't make law alone. Even if we look at some other cases, I mean, and even if we're looking at things like Loper, the idea also is, for example, most people have been upset that the Supreme Court struck down the clean air program to regulate utilities, the Clean Energy Plan. Basically, what the Supreme Court said is when you are taking actions of such broad and extraordinary significance, Congress has to step in. Congress has to approve that. So basically what the Supreme Court is doing with the major question doctrines and other things is trying to constrain the president and re-empower Congress, which has been given away a lot of its power to the president because it's just convenient, because they like to blame the president for when things go wrong. And so I try to look at this not as what happens in one case and how it affects the Democrats. I also think about is what is the overall principle and how can it apply to Republican presidents at the same time? And so I would actually argue that several of the decisions that the conservative Supreme Court has made over the past few years is actually strengthening the separation of power system by limiting the president and empowering Congress. And so I think when the president tries to take these broad acts on things like impoundment and other things where there are restrictions, then these same things are going to restrain a Trump or other Republican presidency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can hear listeners. So, as listener advocate, I'm going to say, and I have seen some experts speak along these lines as well. And I think it'll just be probably, but I want to hear your take on this too. That well, that was the past. This immunity case shows us the future, and they've picked a side. And since they left it in their hands to decide what's an official act and what's not, if it's a Democrat, it will not be, and if it's a Republican, it will be.
I think you read. Okay, so here's.
And again, so this speaks almost directly to the doom loop.
Right. So it does speak to the doom loop and that they're expecting the worst. Here's what I would say. I think a lot of people are looking at things from a simplistic perspective. The Supreme Court is not really 6-3 as much as it is 3-3-3. And there is empirical research that shows that people like Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas on the far right, Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett are kind of center right, and then the three liberals are on the left. And even if we look at this past term, in half of the 6-3 decisions, half of them were not conservative against liberals. The idea that conservatives vote in lockstep is mistaken. I will even give Gorsuch as an example. Gorsuch has very strong libertarian views. In criminal cases, he's more likely to vote with the liberals than the conservatives because of his skepticism of government power, and in this case, prosecutorial power. So this idea that all 6 conservatives think the same way is, I think, mistaken. And when you start looking at them individually, you see where there are fault lines on the court and how they're not going to rule on down the line in terms of everything pro-Trump. I mean, we'll look at it from this perspective. In the immunity case, Thomas in his concurrence said the special counsel is unconstitutional. Barrett in her concurrence said, no, it's not. So, I mean, the idea to think that they're all on the same page, I think, is mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And so let's move on to the Schedule F. Now, for folks that may not be that familiar with it, this is kind of the idea of loyalists, and throughout the federal government. And, if you look at some of the folks, that were kind of drafting this or in the Project 2025, they talk about how the reasoning for this is that the first pass on the Trump administration, they didn't do a very good job, like out of the gate, to really have things ready to populate all these appointee positions and stuff like that. So Project 2025 has a number of things about how to be ready for that. So you've got all this queued up, and part of that is the Schedule F. So Trump had an executive order in 2020 called Schedule F that the idea was to reclassify civil servants as political appointees, and that would enable them to fire those without cause or without due process. Or I don't know if due process is the right word, but without any process.
Yeah, right.
And that was revoked by Biden. And Trump says in Agenda 47 that he plans to reimpose it. So, I guess we talked about this a little bit. You were saying that this will be even if he does it, it might be challenged. And as he tries to fill these spots, he may not be able to find qualified people. I don't know if you wanted to add more to that.
Yeah. I mean, we have to remember that the federal bureaucracy is governed by the Civil Service Act as it has been amended, and there are limits on what the president can do. Just because he wants to do schedule F does not mean that he can. And then even if he fires these 10,000, the idea is, can you find 10,000 people who are competent and supportive of your agenda to leave everything, come to Washington and do what you want? And then here's what I'll say most importantly. The civil service tries to work with every administration that it has. And what you see across presidential administrations is when people are there, they gain greater respect for the civil service. Now, does this mean the civil service might say, okay, I don't think you can do this because of that? They're pushing back and saying, here's what we think the law says. That gives the political appointee something to think about. It's also the idea they may say, this may not be the way to do it. Here may be a better way to do it. And so the thing we have to remember is that the civil service, to the best of their abilities, is going to try to work with the administration because they know a heck of a lot more about how the agency works than the political appointees, because they've been there for a long time, and political appointees last about 1.5 to 2 years. And so for many of these people, they come in, they got these great ideas or these big ideas, but they don't know how to implement them. That's how the civil servants' job is, to help them, and they walk them through the process. So by the time they leave, people have a greater appreciation for them. So I don't think they're going to have quite as many problems as they would think. But just because the administration wants to do something also doesn't mean they can do that. And that's why guidance from the civil service, from attorneys, from even judges in cases becomes important.
Well, yeah, it's funny about the civil service because it's probably if you asked almost any president, they'd sort of feel like somehow all these bureaucrats are getting in their way, right? And so
Yeah.
and I think you mentioned it in your doom loop piece about how on the Republican side, that's one of these things. Like they feel like there's just this big sort of left owns all that, and and I find that hard to believe. I mean, the civil servant in particular, or the civil service in particular, is pretty much drawn out of the population. So I would assume it's a fairly good representation of the population. I don't know. I might be wrong. I don't know if anybody study on that, if they lean heavily left or right as individuals. But as you
Well,
say,
yeah, well, actually, there are studies on that. They're closer to the partisan split, but they're actually tilted toward the left. But here is the thing: it all depends upon what agency you're talking about. If you're looking at Health and Human Services, surprise, surprise, it's filled with the left. If you look at Defense Department, intelligence agencies, and things like that, this probably doesn't surprise you. It's filled with more people from the right. The idea is that people tend to apply to agencies that reflect their views, and they're hired and promoted by their promotion of the agency point of view. So I think what you're going to find is Republicans are probably more concerned more about the social welfare agencies, while Democrats are more concerned about law enforcement, economic, and intelligence and defense departments, because they think they're less likely to agree with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, it would seem to me like if you had 10,000 people getting fired, that's going to be potentially 10,000 like false and firing, lawsuits. I mean, it seems like there's going to be maybe not 10,000, but there's probably going to be a lot of people that raise, and probably with the help of like an ACLU or other organizations,
Yeah.
use some of those as, test cases for some of these laws to see if it would work too. And I guess we'd find out as that runs through the courts how that would play out.
Right. And if you look at the groups that are preparing for this, they are doing a lot of training of college kids and recent grads. Now, I love my students, but there's very few of my students who I'm going to put into a high ranking position right out of college in major agencies and tell them to pursue the administration's agenda. In fact, I would think they would be more susceptible to influence from civil servants because they have less experience in the first place.
Right. And I guess, a lot of the other, sort of things about this kind of tail off into other things like using the acting designations for, I suspect, he liked to do that before. He's probably going to continue to do that. But it's just kind of the way things work. I don't think there's a lot anybody can really do about that, is there?
Well, when we look at the acting designations, what we have to remember is first, someone has to be confirmed before they can be named acting. Second, when someone is an acting official, they have less power than a Senate confirmed one. So if an acting official tries to do too much, the courts have already said you can't do this. And this is what a conservative Supreme Court said during Trump's years. They put limits on what acting officials can do.
Is there a time limit on an acting if they don't get approved by the Senate?
6 months, I believe.
So there is a time limit of some kind.
Well, okay. So here's how I think that's true. Biden wanted to name the Deputy Secretary of Labor Secretary of Labor. So when the Secretary of Labor resigned, she became acting secretary. But the Senate has not confirmed her. In fact, they will not confirm her. And so she's in a limbo position about what she can do. As the deputy secretary, she's next in line, but the fact that the Senate won't confirm her presents certain obstacles to what she can actually do.
Mm-hmm. So I guess on a sort of scale, I mean, Trump's obviously going to try to put more loyalists in. I mean, who wouldn't, right? I mean, what kind of what kind of success do you think he'll have? I don't know, scale of 1 to 10 or something.
I'm going to say 2 or 3, and I'll say it for this reason. The president has like 1,200 people that they have to appoint. It takes them over a year or so to even nominate all of the people to fill the Senate confirmed spots. If they struggle to do this to confirm Senate confirmed spots, I think they're going to also have a lot of trouble confirming all of these other, or finding people to do these other spots, because you still have to go through the civil service system to be hired by the federal government and everything else, and this takes time. Even these Schedule F people, my guess is, cannot be hired day one. I'm not sure on all this, but that would be my guess if they're taking positions in the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to, I think, one of the ones I'm probably most concerned about personally, and I think a lot of people are worried about, is kind of the weaponization, opportunities or ideas of weaponization of the DOJ. I mean, Trump has used a lot of rhetoric about going after enemies and things like that. And that has heated up, actually, since, well, over the last few years. So how realistic are some of these ideas? So there's the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, which was kind of as part of that came about as Nixon, I believe, to prevent abuses like those Nixon did, I think is where that comes from. And it's sort of, isn't that also where the special counsel, kind of rules come from, and sort of to try to ensure this degree of independence from the DOJ and White House? And so on Agenda 47, he talks about kind of wanting to tear a lot of that down and do these direct retaliations. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, okay, so there are a couple of things with that. A lot of the special counsel stuff is in Department of Justice regulations, so they could rewrite those regulations on some level. Second thing is, if you follow Justice Thomas's concurrence and what Judge HOTLINE can and has ruled, is special counsels are unconstitutional. So, I mean, you've got that thing where he's saying, "Yay, big victory for America." Can he go around and change that? Now, consistency isn't something that Trump has ever been a big something that has guided him in things. But the other thing is, you would still have to have and if he did not do that, he could appoint someone as a U.S. attorney who could then prosecute someone. But the thing is, a U.S. attorney is going to be skeptical of bringing something that they think they have no chance of winning. And the other thing you have to remember is there are other checks outside of the Department of Justice. So if you're going after Biden for something he's done as president, well, the person who has to prosecute this is the U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia, which means he has to get an indictment from a grand jury in a city which voted 90% for Biden in 2020, and which will draw a jury from a venue which voted for Biden 90-10. So the idea is, I think there are some other checks along the way. And I also think with Trump, a lot of things are bravado. He says something, I don't necessarily sure he's going to follow through on them. He talked about locking Hillary up, but never followed through. And I think he'll get pushed back from there. The media will rip into him on this. There will be other things that come out. I mean, the simple fact is, look at the House Government Oversight Committee investigation of Biden. It's flopped. And so the idea is a Justice Department investigation going to find something out? If there was a smoking gun of a check being deposited into Biden's bank account, we would have found that by now. An investigation can actually clear Biden of this. And so I'm skeptical it will occur. Political pressure will respond to where he has little incentive to do this. And there are checks on an overzealous prosecutor in the grand jury and the jury system.
Yeah, I mean, you do have some history here too, as well, right? I mean, he was certainly talking about lock Hillary up for his whole campaign was that, and then he never really did anything with that. You also had John Durham, the John Durham case, and Durham, ended up, I think he tried one case and then lost it. But and then didn't really, and then wrote a thing about how everyone's terrible and they broke all these laws, but didn't actually charge anyone with any crimes.
Exactly. So I mean, I think that may be the model of what you would see is someone investigates, they write a report, but they decide not to prosecute.
Yeah.
Now to say that, that's still difficult for the person who's being investigated. Their name is dragged through the mud. They're spending money on attorneys and other things. So I don't want to say that it's easy. I think it's something that people would have a very difficult time going through on a personal level.
Yeah, he probably could make somebody's life kind of miserable.
Yes.
And one thing that's in there too is also this kind of discussion of sort of selective prosecution. And they sort of accuse Biden of that. But what's interesting about that, if that was true, then what about Hunter Biden, and what about even Bob Menendez, who was found guilty? If Biden was doing that, he could say, hey, we have to delay this because we need him to vote. We need Bob Menendez to vote, on something important. So let's not prosecute him for now, right? I mean, and Biden didn't do that, right? Same with Hunter Biden. He didn't. He hasn't inserted him. Now, if it was Don Jr., I certainly would believe Trump would try to slow walk or get that prosecution killed. He'll probably kill the prosecutions against himself, the investigations against himself. So
there's no probable to it. He will on day one.
So I mean that there is a significant difference there, and that is an important difference that Trump could certainly have if he had basic some folks in the Senate that were being investigated for crimes, if assuming they didn't break state crimes and it was all federal, he would have control over those crimes potentially with a compliant DOJ. So he really could either slow walk those investigations or move up other investigations of the people that he, if there were some Democrats being investigated, he would move those investigations up. So I think that's a real possibility.
Well, a little pushback, a little here, in that most people thought Hunter Biden originally got a sweetheart deal, and so people say that that played a role. And with Senator Menendez, he's from a blue state with a Democratic governor. If he resigns, which hopefully he will after his conviction this afternoon, a Democrat will be appointed in his place, and so there's no real loss there. But yeah, I think that there is a fear that there might be some retribution. Whether they'll go after Democrats or not, only time will tell.
Well, so what are some of the backstops there? What do you see? Do you see some, people withstanding that could bring lawsuits in those cases?
In terms of challenging the prosecution, or
well, let's say it was a lack of prosecution. There's not much anybody can really do about that, right?
Right. In terms of no,
if they cancel an investigation or something.
There's not, because prosecutors have what's called prosecutorial discretion.
So the only case with there is if there were any state crimes violated, potentially some state attorney general could get involved.
Correct. Which is why you see the New York prosecutions, to where they're saying, all right, he escaped federal justice. We'll give him a form of justice at the state level.
Do you see any other, I mean, like we said before, Trump has talked a lot about all these enemies. He almost has kind of an enemy list of, it's all over the place. But I mean, how realistic, I mean, how much do you see him doing some of this? He's obviously talked about things like treason accusation and the death penalty. I think a lot of people feel like that would be a challenge to do. And it's not even really, I don't know. It's kind of the kind of thing that even Trump, the odd thing about Trump is he likes being liked. So if he has too much pressure, again, it feels like it's going to be not that popular. I could see him sort of being reluctant to do it. We saw that in his first term.
Right. Yeah, he may feel a little bit more empowered this time, but I think there will still be pushback. He may give in. And the other thing we have to remember is, even if there's a political prosecutor, they're going to rely on the civil servants in the Justice Department and the U.S. Attorney's Office to do the investigation and the grunt work. And there can always be pushback from those individuals also. And those people also have civil service protection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so part of this tamping down some of these fears is what you were saying earlier about, even with this immunity clause, it's not a 6-3 Supreme Court. It's more like 3-3-3. So maybe they're not totally, kind of in bed with Trump on every issue. So he might have some pushback there. I think that's a big one to a lot of these fears kind of depend on the Supreme Court being completely partisan.
Yeah, and I don't think that's something. It's not as partisan as people believe. And the other thing we haven't talked about is who wins the Senate, because it also depends upon, can Trump get the people he wanted confirmed. And we also have to remember there are actually moderates in the Republican Party, like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who have stood up to Trump and have been re-elected. And so I think they're going to be a break on him also. I wouldn't also be surprised if Mitch McConnell wouldn't want to get a little revenge on Trump for some of the things that he has said about him as he leaves office in 2026.
Yeah. So I wanted to, this is something I've been really struggling with. And I think it's even more so with these recent events. that you talk about how part of the as examples of the doom loop. You talk about how Democrats see Trump and MAGA voters as a threat to democracy because Trump lied about winning in 2020 and tried to prevent the transfer of power, and Republicans are suppressing the vote, and the Supreme Court is taking away rights and protecting Trump. Um, and one thing, I mean, I want to say about, and you call these hyperbolic claims, but I mean, Trump did lie about 2020.
Yes.
And I don't want to feel like we can't talk about these things because they are real.
No. I mean, and as we've discussed before, Trump is he lied. Everyone knows it. Well, not everyone knows it. If people do the research, they know it. He's had 4 years to prove it. He can't. That is a legitimate concern. In terms of things like a compliant Supreme Court, I think I've cast doubt on that. In terms of suppressing the vote, the research is clear. Voter ID doesn't do anything at all to the turnout. So I think that while some cases are legitimate, some complaints are legitimate, but that doesn't mean all of them are. I think we have to take each claim and judge it on its own merits. And I think part of the problem is when you are on one side, you don't always look at things objectively. I think we have a little Trump derangement syndrome on both sides where people on the left think he can do nothing right and people on the right think he can do nothing wrong, and they're both mistaken. So when someone does something wrong, it should be pointed out. But because someone does something you don't agree with, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, an abuse of power, or immoral. And that's kind of what I want to push back against. I think there are plenty of reasons that you can give why Donald Trump should not be president. But I don't believe everything people say is accurate. I think they're thinking emotionally more than with their rational part of their brain, and it's scaring themselves and it's scaring others. And I think this is when people are thinking we can forego institutional forbearance because this other side cannot win. And I'm going to say one other thing I think which is problematic. Historically, we have attacked other leaders. We are now attacking other groups of Americans. And I think that's a slight difference. So I think there's one thing about saying I dislike Trump. I don't think MAGA supporters are a threat to democracy. Do they have some strange ideas, perhaps? Do they believe things they shouldn't? Yes, but I believe if you talk with them and learn more about them, you're not going to be as scared of them as you are.
Well, and right, and it can be destabilizing moment when you do that and you talk to folks that you feel like you've sort of been. The narrative is that they must have all these traits. They're crazy. They're dumb. They're racist. They're all these things. And when you talk to them and you find that's not true, it can be very destabilizing, right? And those destabilizing moments are important to us. But I still struggle with the right balance of how. I guess what I want to do is see if we can waylay some of these concerns. Like you were mentioning in the beginning that you don't want Trump to win, but you feel like if he does, we'll get through it. And a lot of people don't think that's true. And I know that's a bit of that's not an exaggeration to say people don't think that's true or think that we won't get through it. But let's talk about, why we think we our institutions will hold and that kind of thing. So, I mean, last time a lot of his behavior up until the election was kind of Trump. He's Trump. He's doing all these things. But from the time he lost the election to when he left, boy, there was a lot going on there that was extra legal. I would say is extra legal, and I would say is anti-democratic, and and anti-rule of law. And those are the things that concern me the most, that when he got in that mode, he really turned it up. So, in the end, why did some of that not work? Well, you had some of those, I don't know if civil servants are the right word, but in some cases that, but you also had appointees and others. You had state people at the state level that even, a lot of Republicans, that were backstops to a lot of the stuff he wanted to do. So in some sense, will those state people be there? Hopefully. Again, if that something like that happens. But so what do we think? I mean, he's demonstrated that he was willing to do that one time. With the second term, you certainly could see him wanting to do that as kind of what that means, like what that means for a second term. I mean, and obviously the real hardcore Trump people would say, well, it's not going to be second term. It's going to be forever. He's going to be president for life. And, so what are some of the things that would be the biggest ways that would kind of keep him in check?
Okay. So the thing, I think the best argument that people make in terms of why he would be a threat is in his first term, he had traditional Republicans around him who constrained him. He will not have that if he wins in 2024. I think that's a legitimate concern. However, these people will also be constrained by courts, Congress, politics, public opinion, and everything else. I mean, so what we have to remember is if they go too far, our system is designed to kick in. What we notice in politics is the public changes its mood based on whoever wins. When a conservative is elected, the mood becomes more liberal. When a liberal's elected, the public mood becomes more conservative. And so there's always these counterbalancing forces that are there. There are plenty of Democratic state attorney generals who will sue. There are plenty of liberal nonprofits that will sue. Just like we had protests in his first term, we will have protests his second term. There will be a press that will be very skeptical of him and will report skepticism of him. And the simple fact is, our nation has enough people on the other side and moderates to where any president will always have low approval, which then makes partisans who are in swing districts concerned. And they also put a brake on the administration because they say, hey, we'll lose our seats if we do this. And that gives them a incentive to not go as far as they want.
Yeah, and I guess that's a little bit of, we've talked before about this, that one concern I have is there's so few, there's a lot less competitive districts anymore. I mean, so many of these districts are safe now that you don't have as much pressure there.
But the fact that our margins are so close, what that means is just a few people defect and things go nowhere. I mean, look at the past 2 years of House Republican rule. This is a game that can't shoot straight. Are they all of a sudden going to be coherent and organized and vote straight down the line as Trump wants? I think that's somewhat doubtful. Mm-hmm. Unless they get a large majority, in which case they can ignore those people. But then in the Senate, you still have the filibuster. And I can tell you right now, Republicans will not eliminate the filibuster. They see that as a break on large government. And there are enough institutionalists in the Senate to prevent that, which means Trump will not be able to enact the most conservative legislation that he wants.
Right. I mean, they see that as definitely a sort of avoidance of sort of simple majority rule kind of problem.
It's exactly because their view is if they do it, the other side will do it, and they're afraid of what the other side will do. So they actually have a little institutional forbearance in that way. And there are a lot more Republicans who are skeptical of filibuster reform than Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema among Senate Democrats.
Hmm. Yeah. I would say, one thing, yeah, and I guess I'll finish with this. One thing that I think a lot of people are upset about, and why I think it drives some of these, more extreme, or maybe a lot of anxiety, but potentially some more extreme actions are, that basically we haven't really been able to see any closure on these Trump cases. Like Trump's not going to be, we're not going to see any accountability for either the documents case or any of the January 6th related stuff. Certainly before the election and maybe never. Um, and I think that really frustrates people, and also, feels like, and I would say that the Supreme, you could make a case that the Supreme Court was protecting Trump in those situations, and maybe you can check me on that as well. But I feel like by them, slowing down the January 6th process, and there's a lot, we've talked about this before. There's a lot of blame going to go around on this too, because if they had brought those cases in 2021, we may not be here, this kind of thing. So there's a lot of blame to go around for this, but I could see people making that argument that this is a case where the Supreme Court did protect Trump just by slow walking those. So that's probably enough to just.
I mean, my argument to that is that it typically takes the case to reach the Supreme Court in 2 to 4 years from Judge Shutkin's decision in December to the Supreme Court decision in July. It took 7 months. That's light speed for the Supreme Court.
Well, and that's something a lot of folks don't really realize. Like, we have this kind of TV version of these cases that are settled in 17 and a half minutes on a TV show. When in even if it's a documentary, you're getting the documentary in 25 minutes, but the actual thing was 12 years or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, and so I understand those concerns. I'm not a fan of Trump. I think he needs to be prosecuted for interfering in the election. But I also know how the Supreme Court works in general. And so, I mean, that's kind of my big takeaway from this, and how I look at this. Now I study politics. I understand how the government works. I think what we need to think about is look at how our system has worked. Look at the basic checks and balances, and think about what's probable, not what's possible. Once you start making that distinction, you start seeing that many of these things that Trump may want to do isn't very probable, which makes me think I don't have to fear as much what he wants to do. And I hope other people would look at this possible versus probable, because I think that changes things an awful lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think, something a message I've been really trying to drive on, more recently with a lot of these tensions is no one's saying, not to be an advocate, for whatever causes that you're interested in. But I think we have to be realistic. I think the idea of being realistic that you're not going to win every time. Even if you say, well, Republicans could take advantage of this immunity thing someday. Yeah, guess what? Republicans are going to win someday, no matter what. If it's not Trump this time, they're going to win eventually. You can't win an election forever. So we've got to get used to the idea of losing. I think it goes along with what you were saying, is that you don't just support democracy when you win. You've got to support these institutions when you lose. And I think people are really struggling to kind of come up with what are the ways that I can do that. And so, that's a big one there too. But we have to just get comfortable with that, losing is part of this.
Well, and the other thing I said about advocating, that's something you should all do. But you need to advocate to people who don't agree with you. When you advocate to people who already agree with you, you're not changing anybody's minds. And so you need to talk to people who disagree with you, listen to them, see what they're saying, if any of their points have any merit to them, and respond based upon what they're saying, not what you think they're saying. When that happens, you may have a different view of that person. You may also be able to change their minds. because you talk at someone, you never change someone's mind. You talk with someone, you can.
And you might have your mind changed.
Yes, and your mind might change. And remember, you may not win this debate, but you may win the next one. So keep on trying.
Right. And so do you have any advice for like, and I'm not encouraging people to say, well, just give up and your side's going to lose. But if your side's going to lose, it's going to lose someday. So when your side has lost, what are some sort of, beyond political violence and things like that, what are some like good ways to go still support these democratic institutions and things like that?
Yeah. So I think things that you can do is you can work for or donate to a nonprofit that's doing good work in your community. You might actually find people on the other side who's working at that same one. I think there's nothing wrong with voicing your support on social media, writing letters to the editor, working for a party, donating to a party or a candidate. There are all sorts of things that we can do, which we are called to do as citizens, but we're also called to do them in a certain way, not under the idea that we're right and they're wrong, but we have to go in with the understanding, with a certain amount of humility that you may be right. Senator Howard Baker served in the Senate from 66 to 84, rose to be Senate Republican leader in the minority and the majority. And when he was trying to convince people, he had a simple thing that he was known for saying, well, you may be right. And so by signaling that, he said, I don't have all of the answers and I'm listening to you. And that led people to be open to listening to him, to the things that he had to say, which allowed him to find the compromises necessary to get things done. And I think that's a key thing. The other side may be right. And if we go in with that certain amount of humility, I think that's a very important first step. The other thing I'd say in terms of fearing if the other side wins, the other side has won in the past. And what's happened? I'm pretty sure our country is still here. I'm pretty sure people are still able to vote. I'm pretty sure people are still condemning Donald Trump each and every day. There's still a free press. Everything is still working. Not quite as designed, but pretty close to it, to where our freedoms are not being taken away. We still have means of petitioning and influencing the government.
Yeah, that's a huge one because it's so easy to lose sight of that, of how, like, from a real perspective. And, sometimes that means traveling to another country or seeing what, if you're going to throw around a term like fascism, go to a place and see what that really looks like,
Yeah, or even read about what fascism is. I mean, and once you do that, it's a little bit more difficult to line that up with a Trump presidency.
Or a Biden presidency either, right? Because people call Democrats fascists too, right? So,
yes.
And same thing with the free press, right? I mean, you can complain about our press and that kind of stuff, but I mean, go to a place that actually doesn't, only has state-run media or has a very controlled press. I mean, it's, there's a difference. There's a big difference. So, I mean, you can't, and you couldn't, go to a place where you can't criticize the government, right? I mean, even just complaining about the government, that's a right there that you may not have.
And you're not being thrown in jail.
Exactly. I mean, not everybody has that right. So it's easy to lose sight of all. I think another aspect there that comes across is, we talk about it's working more or less intended the way it's meant to. I mean, we have to remember that it's meant to sort of not work, right? I mean, it's kind of meant to be difficult to get things done. That's kind of the way our government was designed.
Yeah, and that's why I'm very supportive of our system of government, because our founders, they had flaws, but I think they put together a good system because they were realists who realized that people are self-interested. They will pursue what they think is good for them. And so they created a system to try to constrain that self-interest and instead turn it into a way to where it can work for the public interest.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Evans, I really appreciate you making the time for us, and I hope people sleep better at night with this information.
I do too. We are blessed to live in the country we have, blessed with everything that we are able to do each and every day. And I'm thankful for that. And if I reflect on that each day, it makes me feel a little bit better about our country. And even when I see people say things that I disagree with, I still respect the fact that they are willing to stand up and talk about what they believe in. That's a good thing. That's part of what makes America great.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again.
My pleasure.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. The outrage machine can leave us feeling drained and hopeless. But remember, you're not powerless. There are ways to break free from the negativity spiral. Let's combat negativity with positivity. We all need a good dose of hope these days, so head over to our social media pages, Facebook or Instagram, @Outrage Overload, and share a positive news story that inspired you. Scroll down in the show notes and find the Send Us a Text Message link. It could be anything, big or small. Let's create a community that uplifts and supports each other in staying off the negativity spiral. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.